The title of my talk today is Processing of Lexico-Syntactic Features in L2 Language Production. And I will especially talk about the cases of gender and classifier processing. So, let me see how I can get rid of this. Maybe I can put this somewhere else. Yes, I can. Okay. So this is an overview of my talk. I will briefly start by telling you some basics about speaking and psycholinguistic research on speech production, so that we are all on the same page. Then I will give you very quickly some psycholinguistic evidence for the processing of grammatical gender. And then I will come to the two main parts of my talk, namely morphosyntactic features in L2 processing and other syntactic features other than gender, namely classifier processing in Mandarin Chinese. So what is speaking all about? Well, when we investigate speaking in the lab, and I just come from a lecture. I lectured until half an hour ago, talking more or less about the same thing, namely about speech production to my students. So when we investigate speech production in the lab, we usually show or present a stimulus to participants, like, for example, this chair, and then we ask them to name this picture. So participants have to engage in speech planning processes before they can actually respond. So if this were a Dutch brain, the participant would say something like stoel, which means chair in Dutch. And this is quite a fast process that takes place within a little bit more than half a second for objects that are familiar and relatively high frequent in the language. So we can manipulate the stimulus, and we can measure the reaction, the response, and the response times and the errors, but what we cannot directly get access to is what we are basically interested in, namely the speech planning processes. Now, there have been models built on the basis of lots of these types of experiments. For example, the famous model by Pim Lefeld, published in 1999 in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, also known as the LMR model, the Lefeld-Rudolphs-Meyer model, where we find a division of the speech production process into two basic modules, one responsible for the conceptual preparation of a pre-verbal message and syntactic encoding. Then we access our lexicon, and from there, once we have selected a word, we need to phonologically encode that word before we can actually produce it overtly. Now, this is a representation of the potential complexity, or an attempt to illustrate this potential complexity of words in the lexicon. So when we have, for example, a word like Staat in German, meaning state, there have to be markers to or pointers to its gender, to the number, so it's a singular form, but also to the determiners that correspond to the word, and of course also when we produce the word in the plural, there has to be another representation that represents the plural representation on the lexical level, and then of course there's also all the stuff on the phonological level, on the word form level, that we need to actually encode the word. So it's quite a network. And it's not completely clear how that network looks like, but it's complicated. We know that for sure. And of course, we want to find out more about how this network looks and what the characteristics and constraints of that network are. One way to do this is to ask people to produce noun phrases, actually. So when you present participants with a picture like this, you could ask them to say something like the red chair, de rode stoel in Dutch. So this has the advantage that people need to select grammatical or syntactic information such as gender, because determiners in Dutch are gender marked, And so in Dutch noun phrases, they must agree with the noun referent in the phrase. So because stoel in Dutch, chair, has common gender. The determiner form de also is a determiner form that has common gender, and not, for example, the one that has neuter gender. So that is to say that we can use noun phrases to investigate the selection of syntactic features during lexical access. Okay, so let's see what this can be used for. So we can construct experiments, for example, where we present a picture that has to be named, and we present a distractor word at the same time that people have to neglect. They have to ignore the distractor word and name the picture, okay? And we can choose the distractor word in such a way that it either has the same gender, like in this case, so this is the gender congruent condition, or it has a different gender. So in the gender incongruent condition, the distractor word would have a different gender than the name of the target object. Now, it's important to realize that in both cases, people would have to say something like the chair, for example, or the red chair. You have to decide whether you want an adjective noun and determine a noun phrase or determine an adjective noun phrase. But in any case, people would have to produce a gender-marked element, like, for example, a determiner. So in this experiment, people said something like a stoel, and they would have to ignore the distractor word. But if you compare these two conditions, that is to say, the gender congruent and the gender incongruent condition, what happens is that people are faster in the gender congruent than in the incongruent condition. Now, if you look at the plural, this is no longer the case. And our assumption is that or the explanation for that is that in the plural, there's only one determiner for both genders. So you find the gender congruency effect only in the singular when the determiners are different, but not in the plural where there is the same determiner being used for objects of both that have both genders. So importantly, there is an interaction between number, so whether it's singular or plural, and congruency, whether it's congruent or incongruent. And this can be modeled in a model like this. So where you have on the right side, you see the naming of the target object, the chair that has that activates a lexical concept, which will activate a lemma. The lemma will then activate the syntactic feature, so common gender in this case, which will activate the correct determiner form. And at the same time, the distractor word, which you see here on the left side, will also be active and activate a word form, activate the corresponding lemma level form, and activate a different gender feature. And the different gender feature will also activate a different determiner form. And what happens is that when you have to select the determiner form at the word form level, there will be competition happening, and you can only select one of them because you can only speak one word form at a time. Now, when the gender is the same for both the target and the distractor, then there will be no competition because at the lemma level there will only be one feature that will be activated, and the feature will only activate one determiner word form. Okay, now what happens in L2 processing? Do we find similar processes of morphosyntactic features also in L2 processing? So as we all know, there are many thousand different languages worldwide. But so far, the research has only focused on a couple of languages, at least with respect to experimental linguistics. So of the 7,000 languages worldwide, only a couple of them have been thoroughly investigated psycholinguistically. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done to do more cross-linguistic, but also second language research in terms of people who have also learned languages that have not been as a second language, that have not been investigated that much so far. So here comes a study about second language gender processing. And here are the research questions. So this is work by my former PhD candidate, Sarah von Grebner. And what Sarah was looking at was whether there are traceable effects of gender congruency and also cognate status on non-native production, and what the time course of non-native production is, and especially when the target language would be selected in second language processing. So here is the task. So the task that she worked with was the picture naming task in the non-native language. And she measured the reaction time. So it was behavioral and electrophysiological at the same time. So she also monitored participants' brain responses by EEG. Now, participants were 33 native German speakers with a B1, B2 level. That means intermediate level of Spanish. So they were learners of Spanish, late learners of Spanish. And the manipulation was that words or pictures would have either the same gender in German and Dutch, or a different gender in German and Dutch, and they were either cognates or non-cognates. And as I said, we looked at accuracy, but also naming latencies, and of course, some ERP components, especially the P300. So here's a visualization of the paradigm. So people would see a fixation cross, then a picture would come up. So in this case, the strawberry is la fresa in Spanish, and it's die Erdbeere in German. So it's the same gender, both are feminine. Whereas the key is chiave in Spanish, feminine, but it's der Schlüssel in German. So it's masculine in German. Okay, and then the reaction times were measured and the EEG was monitored. And what Sarah found was that, so here's you see for the accuracy, you see the graphs on the left and the naming latencies on the right. And you see the conditions that are color-coded, basically. So what you can see is that people were more accurate in naming of gender-congruent items compared to gender-incongruent items. So that is to say, when pictures had the same gender in Dutch and, in German and in Spanish, people were faster in, people were more accurate in naming them, but they were also faster in naming those items. So the fastest naming times were there were faster naming times for gender congruent items as compared to gender incongruent items. This is what you see here on the right. Now, this is very interesting, of course. What's also interesting is that Sarah found an effect on the P300, which is usually associated with cognitive inhibition. So the P300 effect was highest for the congruent cognate condition, that's the red condition, and lowest for the incongruent cognate condition. That's the pink line that you see here. We had the hypothesis to also find increased N400 effects for the incongruent non-cognate condition. However, in this experiment, we could actually not find any sign of a N400 effect. However, very nice and clear P300 effect turned out. So more positive amplitudes for congruent cognates as compared to incongruent non-cognates. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, this suggests, the behavioral effect suggests that the non-native language was not selected before before the lexical retrieval stage, because otherwise these effects of congruency in terms of gender would not have shown up. If you had already selected the target language before the lexical retrieval stage, you should not have found any evidence or any influence of the gender of the other language on the naming latencies. However, the EEG or the ERP results actually show that there is a cross linguistic influence that lasts even longer. The cross-linguistic influence shown in the ERP shows that there is this influence continues until after the lexical retrieval stage, at least until the phonological encoding stage, and this is because otherwise we would not have found any effects of the cognates. So in fact, cognates, there is a cognate facilitation effect in this experiment, and this can only be due to the phonological processing of the target and the non-target taking place. Yeah, so the locus of the language of the target language selection has to be at or beyond the phonological encoding in terms of the Lefeld-Rudolph-Meyer model. Okay, now this has all been about grammatical gender so far. Now, what about other syntactic features in other languages? As I said, there are many other languages around the world, and not all the languages have gender. But other languages, for example, the Sino-Tibetan family often has classifiers. And classifiers may be similar to gender in terms of being used to subcategorize the nominal system in some way. So also classifiers, we believe, and we have evidence for that, are processed and represented in a similar way as grammatical gender. So let's have a look. So first of all, what are classifiers? Classifiers are inherent lexical features of nouns in languages that have classifiers, and you need an entity sequence of, for example, a numeral, demonstrative, or a quantifier. Then you need the classifier and then the noun. So for example, to say something like one chair in Chinese, you would have to use the words that correspond to one, to the corresponding classifier, and chair. Now, the classifiers are partly predictable from semantic features such as animacy, function, shape, size, or texture. But they are not completely predictable. So there is an absence of a one-to-one correspondence between semantic noun categories and classifiers. So that means that semantic overlap is influential but not dominant, and classifiers are also, they must be stored at the lexical level. Classifiers are also lexical information in Chinese. Now, how did we investigate classifiers in the first place? Well, we used the well-known picture word interference paradigm, presented pictures, and it was you basically had a 2x2 design. So distractor words were either gender congruent or gender incongruent. So that's the C+, C- condition that you see here. And they were, on top of that, they were either semantically related or unrelated with the picture name. And what we found was that we tested 21 native speakers of Chinese in a 2x2 factorial design, measured their reaction times and their EEG. And what we found was that, so here's an overview of a of the cases that we tested. So we tested either 2 or 3 instances of the same object. So there was a little bit of variation, such that participants did not always produce the same number, and then sometimes they had to say. So, for example, in this example, they had to see 2 knives, and then in another example, they had to say something like 3 bananas, and then they had to say 2 tables, and then and so on and so on. And they always had to say this by selecting the correct quantifier, but also the correct classifier. So what did we find? We found that in the congruent condition, they were significantly faster than in the incongruent condition. And there was also a semantic interference effect, so semantically related pairs were slower than the semantically unrelated pairs. So that's the well-known semantic interference effect. So there was a classifier effect that was significant, but also a semantic effect that was significant. And there was no interaction, statistically speaking, between these 2 effects. Now, when we looked at the EEG data, there was a classifier congruency effect in the N400 time window. And in the same time window, there was also a semantic relatedness effect. So very clear-cut, nice effects that we found there. And you can see that, for example, in the for the semantic condition, which you see here on the left, the related condition was actually less negative than the unrelated condition. That is what, so negativity is plotted up. And for the congruency case, the congruent condition is less negative than the incongruent condition. So this was exactly as expected, to be honest. So now the next research question that we had was that whether acquired morphosyntactic features would behave in the same way, and whether they are processed similarly to the L1 syntactic features. So what we did was we took a group of Dutch Chinese learners, so Dutch native language speakers that learned Chinese here in the Netherlands. We did an experiment testing exactly the same conditions, semantic relatedness condition and a classifier congruency condition. And yeah, it was basically very similar to the experiment that I just showed you, with the exception that it was done in the L2. And these were, yeah, I would also say moderate beginners to moderate. They were probably more moderate than beginners, but they were certainly not high proficient Chinese speakers. So this is work that Xiaoyu Wang and I did, and it's an article that has been submitted. And what Xiaoyu found was as expected, or as we hoped to find, a classifier congruency effect of 24 milliseconds. So quite a relatively large effect, and of course also the expected semantic relatedness effect. So this was also a very nice study and very nice results that we found here. And Xiaoyu also did a EEG, did also EEG measurements, and she indeed also found an N400 effect or replication of the N400 effect for the classifier congruency. So the incongruent condition was more had higher N400 amplitudes than the congruent condition. And for the semantics, she also found a replication of the earlier results, namely more negative amplitudes for the semantically unrelated than the related condition. Now, interestingly, after the experiment, Xiaoyu asked the participants to come back to the lab and do the experiment, do a gender experiment. And she also found for these speakers a gender congruency effect. So that was another nice addition to this experiment. So I hope I have convinced you that there is behavioral evidence that demonstrates a role for grammatical gender during language processing or in the language processing system, and that the selection of gender features affects language production in case it is reflected in the freestanding word forms. So, for example, by producing freestanding articles like in Dutch, or adjectives, or what have you. So the basic importance is that there have to be word forms that are freestanding and that are manipulated or that can be manipulated in terms of gender marking. Finally, that classifiers in classifier languages may be represented and processed in a very similar way as grammatical gender. And this opens, of course, whole new avenues of doing research in these languages as well. So these are the people who actually did all the experiments, Sarah von Grebner and Leticia Pablos for the first study that I presented, and then Man Wang, Xiaoyu Wang, and Xiaoyu Wang for the classifier studies. And with this, I would like to wrap up. If you're interested in the papers, you can find them on my website, and I would like to thank you for your attention. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, sir, for that wonderfully enlightening talk. It was really interesting. If anybody has any questions, the floor is open. We have a little bit of time. We can take a few questions.
Niels, is that your picture? You're standing there with this postman bag. Is that your picture?
Yeah, it is. Actually, it is.
It's yours? Oh, well.
Yeah, it's me, but it's a long time ago. I look different.
Yeah,
This is about 15 years ago in New York City, at a restaurant that has my name. So I had to take a picture.
Okay, that's the logic behind it. Yeah. Yes.
I will stop sharing now. Okay.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So any questions on the issue of gender processing in languages? Hindi and many other Indian languages, they have gender marked, both in nouns, verbs, complicated markings of gender. I did once a study, eye tracking prediction study, where gender was used as a predictive cue, and we got some good results. The people can anticipate to look at a particular item based on a gender cue that might have preceded.
That's interesting. Yeah. That's
yes.
So that's in the same realm as for has been shown for some Indo-Germanic languages already. But it's nice to have this cross-linguistic proof that it works also in non-Indo-European language, or well, in Indo-European languages, but non-European languages. Yeah. Nice. These are nice results. We should also do something together, maybe in about speech production and not only about speech comprehension.
You are only appearing online. I have to find you in India. You have to come to India.
Yeah, I know. I was planning to do so, but the timing was not right. You know, there was something happening called Corona. I don't know whether you've heard about it, but yeah. So that made it impossible.
We are planning again something in early September. So
yeah,
let's see if that works out. Then we'll have something.
Let's see. Yeah. I see that there's someone has raised his hand.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was so inspirational in general. I was working with Daniela Paulieri in University of Granada, so I have many contacts with the gender processing. So I don't know if it's so basic question, but I don't know if you find some difference between congruency in masculine and feminine, because I know that in German, I am talking about the cognate study. In German, you have a neutral gender and masculine and feminine, so you have three three levels of gender. In Spain, we have only masculine and feminine, and our generic is the masculine. So many studies have shown that the feminine incongruence is more salient or more important or more biphasic M400 and P600 in feminine. So yeah, I'm wondering about if you find some of these different in terms of masculine and feminine gender, and also with the gender of the participant, because we have many studies that if you are processing a feminine or masculine word and you are biological masculine or feminine gender, the congruence between the speaker and the gender of the word have many influences. So I don't know if, just wondering if you have many effects.
So it's right. So let me start with your first comment. It's right that German also has neuter gender. So in German we have 3 genders. Spanish only has 2, right? So what we did in this experiment obviously is to leave out the neuter gender, and we only looked for words that either had masculine or feminine gender in both languages. So, and we did not actually find any difference, as far as I know, at least on top of my head, between the masculine and the feminine. I know that in Spanish, what has been claimed, especially from comprehension studies, is that masculine is sort of the default and feminine is much more marked, and therefore also and it occurs also a little bit more infrequently. And so I think in Spanish the difference between masculine and feminine is 60% masculine and 40% feminine approximately. So there's a slight dominance of masculine gender in the lexicon, and apparently that also is reflected in processing times. But we didn't find any differences with respect to the particular gender. And what we also, I mean, I think the vast majority of our participants were actually female students. So I don't think, sorry, excuse me, that there was a possibility to divide the participants into according to their gender. Okay, so whether it's masculine or feminine or anything else, it was not possible to do that. So I cannot say anything about that, but it's interesting to hear that you did find sort of congruency effects between the biological gender of a participant and the processing of stimuli in an experiment. The processing of the gender of the stimuli. Yeah, that's quite interesting. Thank you.
If there aren't any more questions.